Hello. I am practitioner Jay, trauma practitioner, intrapersonal relationship coach, and much more. Welcome to today's class. I'm going to be talking a little bit about relational trauma. I always start my class with a corny and hopefully funny dad joke. So here's is today. What does an astronaut need when he's sad, or she? An astronaut needs a little space. Bum. If you can take 2 deep healing breaths with me, in through the nose, out through the mouth. And you can do this with your eyes open or closed, whatever you feel most safe with. Again, in through the nose, out through the mouth. All right. Understanding relational trauma. Here are the symptoms that come from such stressors. Complex relational trauma experiences closely resemble that of PTSD, but they're different in 2 ways. Complex relational trauma happens in the context of close attachment relationships, and it's usually when there is an imbalance of power. Although the effects of these experiences can be significant, they also can be overcome. So what is complex relational trauma? First, let's be clear that complex relational trauma is not an official diagnosis in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And that's a guidebook for people in the mental health field. Complex relational trauma and its attendant symptoms do, however, most closely resemble post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, give me 1 second. Let me pin myself. Sorry about that. Complex relational trauma and its attendant symptoms do, however, most closely resemble post-traumatic stress disorder, which is in the DSM. However, complex relational trauma could and sometimes is also interchanged with terms and descriptions such as complex PTSD, which is developmental trauma and interpersonal trauma. And I won't go into this because I think I wrote this down in my notes, but CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress, are stressors that happen over multiple times over a period of time, as opposed to PTSD could just be something that we get with a one-time occurrence. But like I said, I think I put that in my notes. Complex relational trauma is interpersonal in nature, and when it comes in context of close attachment relationships, usually when there is an imbalance of power. The reason I am including this topic as a betrayal trauma practitioner is because often in a relationship and marriage, there is an imbalance of power. And hopefully if anybody is reconciling after betrayal, that imbalance of power actually does become more balanced. It could also happen in our primary relationships with parents, caregivers, guardians, or those with authority and have great control over us. For example, the head of a boarding school or a director of an orphanage, where there's the accessibility to the children, to a child or a teen, and a level of dependency from the victim to abuser. Could also be in a marriage situation where you're reliant upon your spouse, whether it's financially, emotionally, spiritually, what have you. So what contributes to this kind of trauma? This trauma is protracted, not isolated, meaning it happens more than once and is usually over a period of time, making it usually cumulative. And this is what I was saying before, is that CPTSD happens multiple times usually. For example, this type of trauma doesn't have to end in childhood. There can be same or different perpetrators, such as your father being the abuser, to having to strive for abusive relationship for men. A lot of times we get into relationships as adults, not so much of, well, a lot of it comes down to familiarity. You know, hey, this person feels familiar to me. I feel comfortable because they feel like family. Well, great. But if your family was abusive, guess what kind of relationship you're in? This trauma undermines, demeans, and erodes the dignity, safety, and well-being of the individual. Examples of events that can lead to complex relational trauma can include the following: experiences with caregivers or guardians that are fundamentally chaotic, unstable, unsafe, inconsistent, unpredictable, and overwhelming. Exposure to domestic violence. That's something I just said. If we feel somebody is familiar and we happen to come from a childhood of a lot of abuse, there's some energy or dynamic with this person that we feel comfortable with. And unfortunately, it might not be the healthiest. Experiences with neglect, apathetic, or emotional unavailable caretakers. Experiences with caregivers who betray you or fail to advocate for you and your needs. Experiences with caregivers with mental illness, like a parent being, like you being parentified. And if you're not sure what parentified is, we can talk later. Or maybe an addict as a parent. The bottom line is, when children experience this type of stress, it's not necessarily the experience itself that becomes the problem. If a child has securely attached, attuned, loving, consistent caregivers who can support them in metabolizing the stress, organizing it, and making sense of it, the child will be more or less able to move through these stressors functionally. However, if trauma or stressors is happening within the attachment relationship with a parent or a guardian, the child cannot usually rely on the adult to help them integrate and process the stress. And this is where a lot of kids disassociate or go into fantasy world, or even start having addictions, because you need to escape. And so what do you escape for? Something that brings you comfort. A lot of times that stuff that brings you comfort, especially as a child, are things that are not healthy. Or if the trauma or stress happens outside of the attachment relationship, but the caregiving adult still fails to support the child in managing, healing, or recovering from it, a child may develop maladaptive and compensatory responses to organize. This basically what I just told you. I just need to stay with my script of the notes that I wrote for this class and stop digressing. Anyways, maladaptive responses are numerous and varied, but essentially, if left unaddressed and untreated, they could lead to the child to become an adult who has ineffective behaviors and beliefs about themselves and others in the world. If you marinated in abuse and dysfunction as a child, you're going to constantly live in a state of hypervigilance in your relationships as adults. So what specifically can these maladaptive beliefs and behaviors look like? Well, there's impacts of experiences. So the impact can be wide, varied, and unique to the individual who experiences it. There's not a one-size-fits-all description. It's absolutely possible that two children growing up in the same household where the stressors took place will have wildly different responses due to many factors, including, but not limited to, child's temperament, resources, resilience, the length and intensity of the exposure to the stressor, the personality or the dynamics of the child, the type of experience, and anyone who supports it in their thing. I always say, and again, I'm digressing and I apologize. Before I was a coach, I was a special ed teacher, and we had to do what's called an IEP, which is an individualized education plan or protocol. So now that I'm a coach, I've actually adopted my own what's called an IHP, which is an individualized healing plan. Because even if you're left or right-handed, you're going to view the world differently. You're going to heal differently. Depending on where you are on the sibling hierarchy, an eldest child, a middle, a youngest child, you're going to view the world different. That's going to make a difference in your healing. So you can read every book on the face of the earth and listen to every podcast. It's still not going to necessarily address your specific dynamic, personality, love language, attachment style, and your situation to help you. While there is no one recipe of what the impact of trauma may be on an individual, there is a list of possible and probable outcomes. So attachment wounds and development of an attachment style that is other than secure. So if you do not have a secure attachment, you're going to find relationships an additional challenge. And if you don't know your attachment style, I have tons of resources for that. We can talk later. Cognitive distortions, erroneous or unconstructive beliefs about yourself or the world, and or intrusive thoughts. Who doesn't have intrusive thoughts, especially after abuse or betrayal? Avoidance behaviors, disassociation, which is the inability to recall traumas or stay mentally present when reflecting or discussing them. Disassociation happens, and this might be a trigger warning. Disassociation happens, like say in a case where sex was forced upon you. Sometimes you have to get out of your body. I talk to a lot of people who tell me as the act was happening, they had to almost get out of their body and look at what was going on from a third party perspective. They all three being them. And so, well, I'm not going to get into other stuff. Anyway, somatic impacts such as hyperaroused nervous system, muscle tightness, trouble sleeping, uncomfortable body sensations. I say that trauma is stored in our mind, body, and soul. What do I mean by that? That means that trauma is stored in our mind. There's no doubt. Trauma is stored in our body. I mean, we know that now through somatic, research, and also our soul, meaning how many times are you not even thinking cognitively or consciously, but you're passing by a place where your spouse, met somebody to have a tryst or a sexual encounter, and all of a sudden your body is starting to feel these experiences, and all of a sudden you realize, oh yeah, okay, that's because I found so-and-so in this area. Or let's just say, June 25th is coming up, and June 25th was D-Day. You might not be consciously aware of it in April or May, but all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, okay, June is next month and that's D-Day. No wonder why I'm feeling like this. That's why I say mind, body, and soul. All right. Interpersonal difficulties in romantic relationships, whether it's at work, friends, neighbors, with the family of origin, where you feel detached from others. There's comorbid, which is co-occurring disorders, such, some people have eating disorders, substance disorders, compulsive behavioral patterns, self-harming. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people who cut, and that's to ease pain, but that's another class. Emotional distress and emotional dysregulations. I'm not going to go on to the details of all these just because I got much more notes on this. Life task impairments, such as holding down a job. A lot of people after abuse or neglect or childhood CPTSD or relational trauma have very trouble holding down a job for many different reasons. They have difficulty creating a stable environment for their kids or housing, difficulty managing money. Certainly your timelines are all skewed. Kids that come from trauma in childhood or relational trauma, and this gets into the hippocampus, because our hippocampus is the one that stores explicit memory, not implicit, explicit. And so a lot of times when you're saying, wait a minute, did that happen when I was 9 or was I no, maybe I was 6, man, and that's because trauma completely skews timelines. Anyways, there is good news. Our attachment style is malleable. We are able to move towards secure attachment later in life, even if our attachment style at one point is insecure or one of the other attachment styles. This is known as earned secure attachment. Just as attachment injuries happen in relationships, so too they can be repaired in relationships. If we're able later in life to find a healing relationship or relationships, we can start healing some of our trauma. And even if you don't find these relationships, and I don't mean necessarily somebody to help you through trauma, although you could, but I'm talking about either finding yourself to help you through trauma, finding a trauma-informed mental health professional. We want to be able to find a secure base with one another, which typically means the person we're in a relationship with shows us consistent attunement and care. This person could be a therapist, like I just said, a friend, a mentor, a child, or someone else. Anyone that makes you feel cared for and understood, with enough positive experiences where we feel seen, respected, safe, and valued, our attachment style can start to change. I want you to take heed, though, because people oftentimes have the best intentions, but not the best responses, especially people that aren't trauma informed. And this includes actually mental health professionals and even church pastors and things like that. So just be careful who you share certain things with, because you don't want to traumatize yourself all over again. You're dealing with trauma, trying to heal it. Trauma can heal. We can start to feel whole and integrated. Healing from relational trauma takes time, but it is possible. As we start to heal, we start to feel more alive, and we live our lives in a way that's consistent with the fullest expression of ourselves, which is something we all deserve. So I just want to conclude this class with just a handful of ways to start the healing process of relational trauma. And the majority of these you heard before. One of them is mindful practices. If you're able to attend a residential treatment center, you'll probably learn the practice of mindfulness and the useful tool it is in recovery. And if you can't do all that, simply reading a book or watching a YouTube video or looking into it. Mindfulness means focusing your thoughts and senses on the present moment. So it's really thinking about what you're thinking about. Because I always say, you got to be careful of your self-dialogue. Once you narrate, then you ruminate, and then you marinate. So stopping that whole process at the root is going to benefit you in the long run as far as healing goes. This helps reduce stress and anxiety, both long-term and in the moment. You can practice mindfulness during your own recovery from trauma by trying meditation. I'm going to stop there. I have a whole bunch of stuff to say on mindfulness, but I'm going to go on to the next one, which is healthy lifestyle habits. With a good foundation of treatment and therapy, a healthy lifestyle supports recovery and healing. And I always say, self-care, 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 self-care. Self-care especially after trauma or abuse, even in general, you should have self-care. Self-care is not vanity, it's sanity. Make good choices about how you live your life day to day, both physically and mentally. This can take a lot of forms, whether it's getting regular exercise, a good night's sleep. I can't stress how sleep is so absolutely powerful with healing. When we are hyper vigilant after betrayal or trauma, every organ in our body is working overtime to center us, not to use these yoga terms, but whatever. So we don't even realize sometimes how exhausted our body is. You need sleep. I mean, you also need downtime, but you need sleep. Eating, you gotta eat. I mean, first of all, quench your thirst, rehydrate all your organs that are working overtime, and try to eat well to the best of your ability. Managing your physical and mental health conditions. Avoid drugs and alcohol. Yes, of course, you want to have an occasional glass of wine. Just calm down and give yourself that. Absolutely. Just be careful you don't overdo it, because alcohol is a depressant. Yada yada. Finding time to spend time with friends and family. And this is supportive friends and family that come with no judgment. And again, be very careful who you tell things to, because the friends and family have the best intentions, not the best responses. If you need to join a support group, wonderful. There's a lot of them online. And avoid negative people who don't support your recovery or healthy choices, especially those where if you're trying to reconcile and they keep calling him a dirty dog or she is a B, and C. So I hope you got something out of today's class. I apologize for being very quick, but there was a lot of information out there. So never forget, self-care is sanity. It's not vanity.